Hi class, we're looking this week at the retreat from public presentation to private preparation of the 12. We've just finished the lecture on the Great Galilean Ministry, a period of 18 months, and now this is a period of time that follows that, and it's different in many ways. The character of it is different. And so if you're looking at your notes, here's some summary verses. And maybe I'll start with the Mark passage. And from there he arose and went away to the region of Tyre and Sidon. And he entered a house and did not want anyone to know, yet he could not be hidden. In Matthew, and Jesus went away from there and withdrew to the district of Tyre and Sidon. And you might see a little bit below that of all the Gospels, that Matthew and Mark devote the most attention to this period. Luke devotes one chapter, and the Gospel of John devotes a single verse. And that verse is at the top of the notes. After this, Jesus went about in Galilee. He would not go about in Judea because the Jews were seeking to kill him. And as I mentioned in the last lecture, there was a character change between this period of time and the previous period of time in the Great Galilean Ministry. In the Great Galilean Ministry, we could say that Jesus was primarily teaching openly, that he was doing many signs and wonders to confirm the teaching. He was making special requests during that time for people not to make known that he was there, a type of almost crowd control, something that allowed him to continue teaching and continuing moving about, but that decreased over the Great Galilean Ministry. At one point it says that he could no longer enter a town openly. This still, though, is different. Whereas he was open to the crowds previously, now he's trying to get away from them. And it's not that the reason for it is that he is trying to spend time especially with the disciples to prepare them. And so in the summary, this is approximately 6 months. 6 months, the first half of a year before Jesus' crucifixion. And in these next notes, we might call it, this first version is the retreat from public presentation to private preparation of the 12, first 6 months in and around Galilee. And in the months after that, it will be mostly in and around Judea. We could say Judea and Samaria because of he spends a couple months in what we would call Samaria. It's in the text, it's called Ephraim, but it's in that region. So we're talking about approximately 6 months. We're talking about the period of time between Passover of that year leading up to Tabernacles. So if you remember that I gave you all a piece of notes that look like a chart like this. And on that chart, I was making clear that when we're talking about Passover, we're talking about March, April. And it might shift during the year, but that's the time of year, March, April. So we're talking about the maybe middle or later of the spring. And then when it comes to Tabernacles, we're talking about September, October. And so we're talking about those 6 months in between that time. And at that second bullet point of the summary is that this special training of the 12 is Jesus is out of favor and on the move in and around Galilee. And so by this point, why has the character shifted? Is because people have pretty much made up their mind about Jesus. The leadership has made up their mind. They've made up their mind for quite a while. But now Jesus has been able to saturate the land with his message, and the everyday person was also able to decide, what do we do with Jesus? And so even though there were people who would crowd around him, many of them had decided that what he demanded of them was not something that they were going to give. And that was the point of John chapter 6, when Jesus confronts them that he's not about just giving out free lunches. And he is their total provision. But they need to dedicate their whole life to him. And unless they're willing to do that, then they cannot be his disciple. So let's spend some time working through these notes. And I give you a review section. How about just before that review, but these notes. Matthew and Mark devote the most attention to this period. Luke, a chapter, and John, a single verse. Doesn't give any additional information about this period of time. Luke does not emphasize the retreat aspect. For Luke, this is all about progress towards Jerusalem. For Luke, after the Mount of Transfiguration, Jesus set his face to go to Jerusalem. So we could say that's talking about purposefulness. He's purposed to go to Jerusalem and to carry out the cross work. And but still, the retreat aspect helps us to think about the reason why he is withdrawing or retreating to regions that are outside of the norm is so that he can find an opportunity to especially equip his disciples, the 12. The 12 in particular, although there were the others, there were some that followed after Jesus, but were never called to be apostles. Apostles, big A, one of the 12. Instead, in your notes, Luke speaks of a contrast of ministry among the people, going to ethnic outsiders, seeking to avoid the crowds and to invest in the 12, and emphasizing his coming death, and then a turn of Jesus to set his face to go to Jerusalem. And so I'm going to skip ahead of this review and give you time to read it. So maybe if you want to pause the lecture at this point and remember the review of the Great Galilean Ministry. But we're talking about point B, the special training of the 12. And so Jesus at this point, this first half of this retreat lecture, is speaking about in and around Galilee. And point number 1, the hard-hearted response of the Jewish leaders and the people of the land. Now, for about 2.5 years, Jesus had been traveling throughout Israel, publicly presenting himself as the long-awaited Messiah of Israel, and laying down the standards to be met in order to identify with him and his kingdom. But the nation had begun to harden itself against the message, and the desire to see this Jesus executed had begun to control the minds and hearts of the leaders of the people. That hardness was manifestly demonstrated to have settled upon the leaders of the people in Matthew 12, as they concocted the charge of satanic empowerment rather than accept the claims of the Lord. And if you remember in your notes for the Great Galilee Ministry, that happens at the end of the second preaching tour, the end of the long day. And Jesus had perceived a similar hardness in the people themselves in John 6, when his so-called disciples abandoned him rather than submit to his demand that they learn to trust completely and exclusively in him. The Great Galilean Campaign had collapsed as a result of these two events. And so what we find in this period of time, beginning with these first 6 months in and around Galilee and then following in and around Judea or Jerusalem, there's a ministry shift in method and emphasis. First, the method and emphasis of Jesus' ministry completely shifts at this time in light of the realization that the hearts of the Jewish leaders had so hardened to the point that they were hungry to see him murdered. Jesus' method shifts to privately prepare his disciples for the next several months. Jesus is actively and deliberately seeking solitude, endeavoring to find time and opportunity to teach his disciples and prepare himself for the great work yet to be finished. This period of about 6 months is to be passed in the exclusive company of the 12 as far as possible. It was also to be spent largely in heathen lands where few Jews would be encountered. However, because of the enormous popularity of Jesus with the common people by this time, this task of finding places of solitude was always a very difficult one. And so Jesus' emphasis shifts from the coming kingdom now to talking about his immediate death and resurrection and subsequent absence from their midst. And you can see that chart on the one hand in the period of public presentation of the great Galilean ministry. It's a presentation of himself as Messiah of Israel. And now, private preparation of his disciples for his impending death. During the public presentation, he was saturating all the lands of the Jews, and now he seeks solitude from the crowds and in Gentile territories mostly. And then public presentation vindicating the claim by means of miracles, and now avoiding miracles and speaking in parables. And that period was a period of 18 months, and now we're talking about 12 months, the first 6 months around Galilee, the next around Jerusalem. Okay, there's another chart that goes into some of those details. Okay, and if you're going onto the next page, the rationale. The twofold reasons why Jesus at this time sought to seclude himself from his own people, the Israelites, was number one, the leaders of the Jews, angry with Jesus ever since his first appearance at the Passover, claiming an authority beyond their own by his activity in the temple, were now furious with him. They were following him everywhere he went, always looking for a way to discredit and kill him. And then second, there was serious danger to Jesus, not only from the Jewish leaders, but also from Herod Antipas, ruler in Galilee and Perea, who had been frightened by the popular response to Jesus. Remember that he supposed that potentially this Jesus who he was hearing about was really John the Baptist raised from the dead. John the Baptist's death was a harbinger to Jesus' own eventual death. Most importantly, though, Jesus wanted time to privately instruct the 12, and the shadow of the cross loomed ever larger, and the Lord did not want the catastrophe of his death to find his apostles wholly unprepared. And so you just imagine that Jesus is going to hand off the mission to these disciples. Here's an important point. Up to this point in Jesus' ministry, through the first 2.5 years and even well into the final year, Jesus had not once foretold his death in an explicit manner. Indeed, when he does foretell that event, the very concept of his dying has a devastating effect on his closest disciples. And as we think about this final year, we need to be sensitive to this issue unfolding by Jesus of the fact of his impending death. And you can imagine that. These disciples had seen Jesus do amazing miracles, speak with such authority, stand up to the most respected but wrong leaders of the Jewish people. And he's Messiah, right? He's coming to rule as king. And now Jesus is saying that he's going to die. You know, we have to realize how this would have hit them. You see in your notes at this point, I hope this little chart helps you to see how this time period is coming together. And so again, we're talking about a period of 1 year of private preparation of his disciples, and around halfway point, we're just talking about location of that type of ministry. And so first, it's in and around Galilee, and we hear about him going to places like Tyre and Sidon. We hear about him going to Caesarea Philippi. We hear about him going to the Decapolis. Those are all around the region of the Sea of Galilee. Some to the north, others to the northwest, maybe another to the east or southeast from there, but it's still in the region of the Galilee. And then at Tabernacles, when he's there for the feast, and then following it for the Feast of Dedication, he is operating around Jerusalem. And one other event is the raising of is Lazarus. That's all happening in this last year and the last 6 months of Jesus' private preparation. Okay, so hopefully that chart makes it come together. A survey of the events of this period. So chronologically and geographically, Jesus made 2 journeys during this first part of his special training of the 12. And you see that map there. One of the arrows is in blue and one of them is in yellow. Okay, and so you can see Jesus going to the district or region of Tyre and Sidon. So those are on the coast, and today we call that the country of Lebanon. But we also see him going to the region of Caesarea Philippi, and you see it on that map as number 6 and number 7, because the traditional spot for the Mount of Transfiguration is right near there. It's Mount Hermon, and so number 1 on your notes to Phoenicia, returning through the Phoenicia, that's the region of Tyre and Sidon, returning through the Decapolis to the Sea of Galilee, and then 2nd to the district of Caesarea Philippi. Okay, and you can see also that when he comes to the Decapolis, and then he comes to, we've talked about this in class, but he comes to the region of the Decapolis around the Sea of Galilee, and that's the region of the Gadara harbor. Okay, so there was perched on the hill surrounding the Sea of Galilee on the southeastern side, there was a city named Gadara, and the place where below that perched hill of the city was the harbor, the access to the Sea of Galilee for that city, the Gadara harbor. People from that region were called Gadarenes. They might also be called Gerasenes because that city was in the larger district of Gerasa, which is closer to Amman, Jordan today. Okay. And so let's look at number 1, the withdrawal retreat to Phoenicia. Jesus and the 12 take residence in a private home. Jesus heals the daughter of a Gentile woman from that region. And this is the woman who comes to him, and Jesus has some choice words, and he says that we don't take the children's food and feed it to the dogs. And we could say, well, why was Jesus reluctant to heal the daughter of this woman? He had been carrying out so much healing up to this point. And look at this quote from Smith. The truth is that his reluctance was not due at all to the fact that the woman was a Gentile, but wholly to the circumstance that he had gone to those parts in search of seclusion. So imagine, you look at this map, it took a lot of work for Jesus to get out in the middle of nowhere in order to spend time with these disciples. And now as soon as he gets there, someone is asking him for help. As soon as someone asks him for help and he does a miracle, he is going to be crowded by more requests for help. So I heard a story one time about this. Imagine that you were a medical doctor, and it was your 10th wedding anniversary, let's say 20th wedding anniversary, and things have been so stressful at work, so many people trying to get in to see you, and so you and your spouse made plans to get away. You have this great plan for a vacation, and so you fly to some remote island, spend thousands of dollars to get there, and when you get there, someone finds out that you're a doctor and they're not feeling well, and they want to see you. So you can imagine that the point was to get away, and as soon as you're there, you're asking for more help. And so finishing this quotation from Smith, it's due to the circumstance. He desired to be alone with the 12 and impart to them the the instruction which they so much needed, and it was with a feeling of dismay that he observed the approach of a suppliant. He foresaw the consequence of granting her petition. The fame of the miracle would go abroad, and he would presently be surrounded by a crowd of sufferers craving relief, and others who came only to gaze and admire. Therefore, he could fain work no miracle, and he would have been no whit less reluctant had the suppliant been an Israelite. You see, the point didn't have anything to do with anything with a person. It had all to do with the circumstance of trying to find a place to train these disciples with the mission after he was gone, and yet he still does the miracle. So there is some reluctance, but Jesus still does it. It's something we probably should learn, maybe from ministry. Is there we don't get to set our timetable and our schedules often, and Jesus adjusted for the greatest of training, and perhaps there's a lesson for us. Number 2 on the next page, the withdrawal, retreat, journey to the Decapolis. And so we could say on his way back towards the Sea of Galilee that he comes south and from the east through the Decapolis. And there he meets a deaf and dumb man who he heals in Mark chapter 7. And great crowds assemble, and Jesus teaches them for 3 days, and then he feeds them. So this is a second grand feeding miracle, 4,000 people. There's a brief return to this region surrounding the Sea of Galilee, and he comes to a place called Dalmanutha or Magadan. And this is an obscure, unpopulated area. The fact that the opposing Jewish leaders find Jesus here seems to reveal that they are on the lookout for him. They had probably heard of his presence in the Decapolis and anticipated that he would be returning soon. This region is west of Capernaum, but still on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee. The Pharisees and Sadducees find Jesus there and demand a sign, not a sing. The third time they had done so. And Jesus refuses and rebukes them. The Sadducees have not been mentioned in the gospel narrative since the early days of the baptism of John, and it is because they had mostly to do with the temple. It's interesting, though, that they are mentioned here in league with the Pharisees, with whom they were traditionally at odds politically. And the demand for a sign, which Jesus had not been doing, appears to be their ongoing strategy, trying to discredit him. This guy says this, but, he can't back it up. Number 3, as Jesus and his disciples depart the place by boat, Jesus warns his disciples concerning the leaven of the Pharisees, and they misunderstand. And Jesus rebukes them for their dullness. And this incident seems to have impressed Jesus anew with the desperate need of the disciples to be instructed and trained. And so he withdraws to the region of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way, as soon as he gets to Bethsaida, right, they're crossing from, let's try to do this backwards, okay? Let's say this is my Sea of Galilee, okay? And let's put Capernaum at the very top. And in your view, Bethsaida would be here, and this plain of Gennesaret would be on this side, and Magadan is over here. Okay, so Jesus comes from this side and sails on the north side of Sea of Galilee and comes over here, and then he's going to depart to go to the region of Caesarea Philippi. As soon as he gets here to Bethsaida, he encounters a man, a blind man, and he heals him. And number 2, the question on the way. Jesus says, "Who do men say that I am?" And one of the Gospels actually says, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" And so there's two questions right there. There's one is the phrase "Son of Man," and and that's a reference to Daniel chapter 7, when the Son of Man, a figure, mysterious figure, comes to the Ancient of Days, and there's a eschatological promising and covenantal talk there going on. And so who do people say that Son of Man is? Okay, so it's a theological debate. But then Jesus also asked the question, who do people say that I am? And that conversation goes together because Jesus is saying, I'm the Son of Man from that passage. And do people understand that? And so that Son of Man figure is the Messiah, is the Messiah figure. And so Peter ultimately, as a representative for the group, he says, you're the Christ. You are the Messiah. You are the Son of the living God. And so that great interchange. Number 3, Jesus' first distinct prophecy of his soon rejection, death, and resurrection comes right after Peter's great confession. And notice the reaction of the disciples to this prophecy and the challenge which Jesus lays before them in light of that reaction. The disciples had succumbed to the rabbinic concept of exclusively conquering political Messiah. The idea of a suffering, dying Messiah had escaped their notice or been forgotten. It's not the first time that Jesus has told about his death. It's just the first explicit time. Just previously before this in Dalmanutha, when Jesus refuses to give a sign to the Sadducees and Pharisees, he says, you're not going to get a sign. But then he says, the only sign you're going to get, so that's interesting, you're not going to get a sign, and then the only sign you're going to get is the sign of Jonah. And what is the sign of Jonah? So there's a lot of confusion here. Jesus is just as Jonah was in the belly of the whale 3 days and 3 nights, the Son of Man will be in the heart of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights. And there's a lot of debate that happens because around the chronology issue of, is Jesus talking about 3 24-hour periods, or is that not the point of the comparison? And what is the sign? Is the sign having to do with the exact time, or is it something different? And I think the comparison has to do with the sign of Jonah is the sign of resurrection. So here's Jonah, who for all intents and purposes is dead. Maybe he died. If you read Jonah chapter 2, he goes to the very bottom of the sea. He's wrapped up into plants at the bottom of the sea, and yet he's revived and he's restored. And Jesus is going to be buried and rise again. And so Jesus is saying, you're going to get that sign. I'm not going to do a sign for you right now. And that's the most conclusive sign for them. If anything was going to change their mind, that was just going to have to be it. He'd given them enough evidence by that point. They're just looking to catch him up. Number 4, the transfiguration of Jesus. The background for this event cannot be properly comprehended except as it considered against the backdrop of Matthew 16, which is the Great Confession. And so we could say, what are we getting at? There is a reassurance that is happening for the inner circle of Jesus' disciples, that his death will not be the end, that he has the power to conquer death. And number 2, the essential significance of the transfiguration. Jesus allowed the inner 3 disciples to become eyewitnesses for a brief moment to the physical glory which will belong to Jesus when he reigns as Messiah upon the earth. And I'll say something that's maybe not in your notes, that there are some parallels that are happening that you need to catch on to. Jesus provides food in a quiet place for 5,000 men and maybe their families. He provides another 4,000 worth of food, and he says that I'm your sustenance. There's a parallel to the way that Moses provided bread. The Lord, through Moses, or at his direction, provided bread in the wilderness, and so there's a correlation to Moses. We could say there's a correlation to Moses on the Sermon on the Mount when he's speaking about the Great Commandments and speaking about the heart of the Great Commandments. And but on the Mount of Transfiguration, we could say there's some parallels to Joshua. There's a conquest happening. Jesus is going to go to Jerusalem and he's going to carry out the mission of God. And I think that's why Luke says that Jesus set his face to go to Jerusalem. Just like the mission of the Israelites to conquer the land at God's direction, Jesus is going to lead a new charge. Number 3, the twofold purpose of the Transfiguration. Number 1, to encourage Jesus as he faced the cross. Number 2, to fortify the staggering faith of the disciples in the Messiah of Jesus, who had just heard that he was about to die. Number 4, 3 sequels to the Transfiguration. After the Transfiguration, the 3 disciples wax bold to ask a question that has been troubling them. If you're the Messiah, Jesus, then what about Elijah? Has Elijah come or not? And Jesus' answer is yes. Remember that the matter of Elijah is that Malachi said that I will send you Elijah. And has Elijah come? Yes. Jesus said, for those who are willing to receive it, John the Baptist was Elijah. So the Elijah figure that Malachi spoke about, God through Malachi spoke about, John the Baptist was that figure. Number 2, descending from the Mount of Transfiguration, the disciples and Jesus encounter the other 9 disciples, and those 9 are disconcerted because they had tried to deliver a demoniac boy but had been unable to do so. And remember that Jesus clarifies the reason why you're not able to do this is some only come out through prayer and fasting. Okay, and I'll just say something quickly along those lines. The point is that Jesus has given them authority to be his ambassador and to cast out demons. And just as Jesus depended upon the Holy Spirit of God during his incarnation, for that the Spirit's help to do anything that a man could not do, Jesus is directing them that the authority that he's bestowed on them is not one that they can just operate on their own. That it still is the power that's bestowed on them for a certain purpose. And he's saying, listen, you cannot just go around and cast out all demons as if you were the one making all the decisions. You must petition the Spirit of God earnestly for this to be done in some cases. And so there's a lot of ink spilled about certain kinds of demons and what's effective to drive them out and what's not. And I don't think that's the point. I think the point that Jesus is pointing to is that I've given you authority to do this, but that authority is still dependent upon the work of the power of the Spirit through you. And you cannot just go around as if it was your own power. And in some cases, you need to ask special permission. Number 3, returning privately through Galilee, Jesus again foretells his death and resurrection. This time, Jesus adds information to his former announcement, the element of betrayal. So not just that he's going to die, but that he's going to be betrayed as part of the means for him to be killed. And remember that this is not the first time he introduced this. In John chapter 6, he said, and one of you is the devil. And one of you is an adversary. One of you is opposing me. And they seem not to even still know who this is. Even at the very end, they do not suspect that Judas is not on their side, and that they do not suspect him. Last efforts, next page, last efforts in the region surrounding the Sea of Galilee. At Capernaum, Jesus pays the temple tax by means of a miracle. Remember, he goes to the sea, take it from the fish's mouth.